New Bizan was not what Yuna had expected. She had imagined human colonies as harsh and primitive places, built by a species from a death world who surely valued strength and survival above all else. But the city that spread below them as the patient hand descended through the atmosphere was beautiful in ways she could not have anticipated. There were gardens on the rooftops and art painted on the walls and children playing in open plazas. And the people who walked the streets moved with an ease that spoke of safety and belonging. And Yuna felt something ache in her chest that she did not have words for. Welcome to human space, Dahyun said quietly as they docked. He had contacts here, old friends from before his daughter's death. And within 2 days he had filed formal asylum papers on Yuna's behalf under human protections for sapient refugees fleeing exploitation. The response from the Veluxy Collective was swift. Overseer Thalon brought the case before a galactic trade tribunal, arguing that human interference in lawful commerce set a dangerous precedent that threatened the economic stability of multiple species. And representatives from a dozen worlds gathered to hear arguments on both sides. Yuna watched the proceedings from a small viewing gallery, her skin flickering in patterns of anxiety she could not control. And beside her, Dahyun sat with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral. The tribunal chamber was vast and cold, filled with beings who viewed her as a legal abstraction rather than a person. And the judges who presided over the proceedings displayed no emotion as they listened to Thalon present his case. The Veluxy Collective's rights are clear under galactic law, Thalon argued, his skin displaying patterns of absolute certainty. This biological unit was legally acquired through standard commerce channels and remains our property regardless of her current location. And the human's unilateral decision to declare her a refugee has no legal standing. The collective abandoned her, the human representative countered. A sharp-eyed woman named Director Kwan, who had been assigned to argue Yuna's case, they left her on a station to die, which under human law constitutes forfeiture of any ownership claims. Human law is irrelevant to galactic commerce. Human space is where she now resides, and human law applies to all beings within our borders. The arguments continued for hours, circling the same fundamental question from every possible angle. Was Yuna property, or was she a person? The Veluxy Collective argued that she had been bred and modified for a specific purpose, and that her defect made her a failed product rather than an independent being. And they cited centuries of galactic precedents supporting the classification of engineered biological units as merchandise. The human delegation argued that sapience itself conferred personhood, regardless of origin or function, and that any being capable of suffering and hoping and fearing deserved recognition as more than a commodity. When the final arguments concluded, the chief judge called for a recess before the ruling, and Yuna found herself standing in a corridor outside the chamber with Dahyun beside her and her future hanging in the silence between heartbeats. What happens if they rule against us? She asked. Then we figure out something else, Dahyun said. But let us wait and see what they decide before we borrow trouble. The recess lasted an eternity. When the judges reconvened and the chamber fell silent, Yuna felt her skin flickering so wildly that she had to wrap her arms around herself to keep from shaking apart. The chief judge, a massive crystalline being whose species Yuna did not recognize, spoke in a voice like wind through caverns. This tribunal has reviewed the arguments presented by both parties, and we acknowledge that the legal questions raised by this case touch on fundamental disagreements between human philosophy and established galactic commerce traditions. Yuna held her breath. However, this tribunal is not charged with resolving philosophical disputes, but with applying existing law to specific circumstances. And the law in this matter is regrettably clear. Her heart sank. under Galactic Commerce Accords. The Veluxy Collective's ownership claim over biological asset designation UNA-7 remains technically valid, and this tribunal cannot nullify that claim through judicial decree. Thalan's skin flickered in triumph. However, the judge continued, this tribunal also acknowledges that human space operates under human law, and human law does not recognize the classification of sapient beings as property, and therefore within the boundaries of human-controlled territory. The collective's claim is unenforceable. The chamber erupted in murmurs. The ruling of this tribunal is as follows. The judge declared, the biological unit known as UNA is hereby recognized as a sapient refugee within human space, entitled to all protections afforded to such persons under human law. And the Veluxy Collective's reclamation request is denied within this jurisdiction. UNA could not process the words at first. She stood frozen as the implications washed over her. And then Do-Yoon's hand was on her shoulder, and Director Kwon was smiling, and somewhere in the chaos of the moment, she realized that she was free, not universally, not completely, but free enough. Free within boundaries that would shelter her. Free in the only way that mattered, after the tribunal adjourned. Thalan approached them in the corridor, his skin displaying patterns of cold calculation. This changes nothing, he said. Beyond human borders, you remain our property, and humans cannot protect you forever. Yuna looked at him. At this representative of everyone who had ever told her she was worthless, and she felt something shift in her chest. You are wrong, she said, and her voice was steady in a way it had never been before. You have been wrong about me from the beginning. She stepped closer, and her skin flickered in wild, chaotic patterns that meant nothing and everything. I am not defective, she said. I am different. And for my whole life, you made me believe those words meant the same thing, but they do not. And I know that now because one human looked at me and saw something worth saving when my own people saw only something to throw away. Thalan's patterns flickered in something that might have been surprise. Your light still does not function correctly. My light functions exactly as it should, Yuna replied. And I am done being ashamed of it. She turned away from him and walked toward Do-Yoon, who was waiting with a small smile on his tired face, ready to go home. He asked. Home, the word felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Yes, Yuna said. I am ready. They walked back to the patient hand together, and when they boarded the ship, Do-Yoon pulled up the crew registry and formally added her name beside his own official crew now. He said, no more lies to station security. Yuna looked at her name on the registry. Proof that she existed. Proof that she belonged somewhere. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Do not thank me, Do-Yoon said. Just keep learning to believe you deserve it. The ship lifted off and rose through the atmosphere of New Bizen. And Yuna sat in the co-pilot seat as the stars emerged from the darkening sky. Her skin flickered in colors that had no name, but for the first time in her life, she did not try to hide them. The Veluxy Merchant Collective found them at Way Station Helix, a neutral trading post where ships of all species gathered to resupply and exchange cargo. And Yuna knew the moment she saw the sleek vessel in the docking registry that her past had finally caught up with her. Do-Yoon saw it too. Stay close to me, he said as they walked through the station's corridors toward the supply depot. And remember that you have done nothing wrong. But Yuna had spent her entire life being told she was wrong simply by existing. And when Overseer Thalan stepped out of a side corridor with 2 enforcement officers behind him, she felt her body try to make itself smaller out of instinct. Thalan was tall for a Veluxy, his skin displaying perfect controlled patterns of authority and calm confidence. And he looked at Yuna, the way one might examine a piece of malfunctioning equipment that had somehow wandered off the repair shelf. Asset designation UNA-7, formerly of Breeding Cluster 9. he announced in a voice that carried through the corridor. You are hereby ordered to submit for reclamation under Section 47 of the Galactic Commerce Accord regarding lost or abandoned biological merchandise. She is not merchandise, Dawing said, stepping slightly in front of her. She is a sapient being and a registered member of my crew. Thalan's skin flickered in patterns of polite dismissal. The human is misinformed, he said, addressing Yuna directly now. You know what you are. And you know that defective units are classified as write-offs under collective policy, which means you remain our property until formally disposed of or reclaimed. Then formally dispose of her, Da-Yun said. Sign whatever document releases her from your claim and walk away. That is not possible. Why not? Thalan's patterns shifted to something colder. Because allowing defective units to exist freely damages our species' reputation as reliable biological products, he explained with the patience of someone discussing simple economics. Every cycle that this unit remains visible to the galactic community is a cycle in which potential buyers question the quality of the Luxy merchandise. And our profit margins depend on the perception of perfection. Yuna felt something twist in her chest. You do not want me back because I have value, she said slowly, understanding dawning. You want me back because my existence embarrasses you. Your existence is an accounting error that should have been corrected long ago. Thalan agreed. The collective invested significant resources in attempts to repair your defect. And when those attempts failed, you should have been humanely terminated rather than abandoned. And that oversight is being corrected now. Do-Yun's hand closed around Yuna's wrist. Warm and steady. She is not going anywhere with you. Human. You do not understand your position, Thalan said. And his patterns displayed something almost like pity. Harboring claimed biological property carries severe penalties under galactic law, including seizure of assets and imprisonment. And I am offering you the opportunity to surrender her peacefully and avoid those consequences. And I am telling you that humans do not recognize sapient beings as property. Human law has no jurisdiction here. Then we seem to be at an impasse. Thalan studied Do-Yun for a long moment, his patterns cycling through calculations. You would risk everything for a defective unit that your own species has no use for, he said finally. This is the irrationality that makes humans such a curiosity to the elder species. This tendency to assign value where none exists. Maybe that is exactly what makes us human. The enforcement officers shifted restlessly, hands moving toward their weapons, and Yuna saw the moment approaching when words would no longer be enough. Do-Hyun, she said quietly, let me go. He turned to look at her, and his eyes held no judgment. Only a question. I am not worth your freedom, she continued. I am not worth your ship or your life or whatever they will take from you if you continue to resist. And I have already lived longer than I expected to. And I have already experienced more kindness than I ever thought possible. And that is enough. Is it? Do-Hyun asked. Is it really enough? Yuna wanted to say yes because saying yes would be easier. Because surrender was familiar and hope was terrifying. But when she opened her mouth, different words came out. No, she admitted. And her skin flickered in wild patterns of fear and longing. No, it is not enough. But I do not know how to want more when wanting has only ever led to disappointment. Do-Hyun nodded slowly and turned back to Thalan. You heard her, he said. She does not want to go with you. And that means this conversation is over. Her wants are irrelevant, not to me. Thalan's patterns hardened into formal threat. Then you leave us no choice but to escalate this matter through official channels. And when the tribunal rules in our favor, and they will rule in our favor, the penalties you face will be far worse than they would have been today. Let them rule, Do-Hyun said. And he began walking backward toward the docking bay. keeping Yuna behind him and his eyes on the collective officers. Let them hold their tribunal and make their decision. But we will not be holding it here. Where do you intend to go? Do-hyun smiled. And there was something fierce in it that Yuna had never seen from him before human space, he said. If you want to argue about whether she is a person or property, let us have that argument somewhere the question has already been answered. Talon did not try to stop them as they retreated. He simply watched with patterns of cold patience and spoke words that followed. Yuna onto the ship and into hyperspace. Run wherever you like. Human, but galactic law extends beyond your borders. And this asset belongs to us, and we will recover what is ours no matter how far you flee. The patient hand jumped to safety, and Yuna sat in the co-pilot seat with her arms wrapped around herself and her skin flickering in chaos. He is right, she said numbly. They will not stop, and human space cannot protect me forever. Maybe not, Do-hyun agreed. His hands steady on the controls. But human space can give us a fighting chance. And sometimes a fighting chance is all anyone gets. Why are you doing this? Do-hyun was quiet for a long moment. Because Soyeon would have been ashamed of me if I did anything less, he said finally. Because being human means believing that people matter more than property. And if I stop believing that, I stop being human. Yuna did not have a response to that. She sat in the flickering light of her own broken skin and watched the stars blur past. And somewhere in the chaos of her thoughts, a small voice whispered that perhaps she was worth fighting for after all. Perhaps she had always been worth fighting for. Perhaps the only ones who were wrong were the ones who had taught her otherwise. 6 weeks passed aboard the patient hand, and Yuna discovered that she was capable of learning things she had never imagined. It started with small tasks, simple things that Do-hyun showed her without expectation or pressure. And at first she was terrified of making mistakes because the collective had punished errors harshly, and her clan before that had treated failure as evidence of her fundamental brokenness. But when she crossed the wrong wires during her first attempt at helping with engine maintenance, and a small shower of sparks made her flinch backward in fear, Do-hyun simply handed her a diagnostic tool and showed her which connections she had confused. Everyone makes mistakes when they are learning, he said. The only failure is refusing to try again. So she tried again within a few weeks. She could run basic diagnostic checks on her own, and she could monitor the navigation readouts during long stretches of empty space. And she had memorized the ship's systems well enough to notice when something sounded wrong in the hum of the engines. Do-hyun began to trust her with small responsibilities. Not because she had earned them, but because he seemed to believe she was capable before she believed it herself. You learn quickly, he told her one evening as they shared a meal in the galley. Faster than most crew I have worked with over the years. The collective said I was slow. Yuna replied automatically. They said my defect affected my mind as well as my skin. The collective was wrong about many things. Yuna was beginning to believe that might be true. She had also started to understand why humans were considered strange by galactic standards. For Do-hyun did things that made no logical sense, according to everything she had been taught about efficient behavior. He kept a small plant in the cockpit even though it served no practical function and required regular water that could have been conserved for other purposes. He played music through the ship's speakers during long hauls, old songs in a language she did not understand. And he hummed along sometimes when he thought she was not listening. He insisted on eating meals at the same time each day, even when the schedule was inefficient. And he always made enough food for both of them even before she had agreed to stay. These things confused her at first because they seemed like waste. But gradually, she began to understand that humans measured value differently than other species, and that they found meaning in small rituals and unnecessary beauty in ways that the galactic community often dismissed as primitive. She found herself humming the songs when she worked alone in the cargo hold, and her skin flickered in soft colors that almost seemed to follow the rhythm. Their next job took them to a Korath mining colony on the edge of civilized space. A delivery of machine parts that would take 2 days to unload. And Dayun warned her before they arrived that the Korath were not pleasant beings to deal with. They respect strength and nothing else, he said. They will try to find weakness in you and exploit it. And the best response is to give them nothing to work with. Yuna nodded. But she was not prepared for what waited at the docking bay. The Korath were massive creatures, nearly twice her height, with thick gray skin and eyes that held the cold calculation of predators. And the administrator who met them at the ship looked at Yuna the way a buyer might examine damaged goods. A Veluxi. The administrator rumbled, his voice like stones grinding together. I did not know humans kept pets. She's crew, Do-hyun said flatly. Here is the manifest for your cargo. The administrator ignored the offered datapad, his attention fixed on Yuna. Your light is broken, he observed, watching her skin flicker erratically under his gaze. You are defective, yes. And I wonder what a human would want with a defective Veluxi when functional ones are so much more valuable. Yuna felt herself shrinking under his scrutiny, the old shame rising in her chest like bile. Perhaps humans cannot tell the difference, another Korath said from behind the administrator. And several others laughed, a harsh sound like metal scraping. We can tell, Do-hyun said. And something in his voice had changed, a coldness that Yuna had not heard from him before. We simply do not care. The administrator finally turned to look at him. You waste resources on something worthless, he said. This is why humans will never be taken seriously among the elder species. Because you let sentiment override sense. And yet here I am delivering parts you need, Do-hyun replied evenly. Because your miners keep breaking equipment that was designed for species with more patience and less muscle. So perhaps you should worry less about my crew and more about keeping your operation functional. The administrator's eyes narrowed, but he took the manifest. The unloading proceeded in tense silence, with Korath workers hauling crates under the administrator's watchful gaze. And Yuna stayed close to Do-hyun and tried to make herself small and unnoticed. It did not work. When the job was nearly finished, the administrator approached them again, and this time his expression held something that made Yuna's skin go cold. I have made inquiries, he said. There is a Veluxi merchant collective offering a recovery fee for lost biological assets matching this one's description. And I wonder if you are aware that you are harboring claimed property. Do-hyun's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the tool belt at his hip. She is not property. Galactic commerce law disagrees, the administrator said with satisfaction. And I think there is profit to be made in returning her to her rightful owners. So perhaps we should discuss terms. There is nothing to discuss, Do-hyun said. She is my crew. And crew does not get sold. Then perhaps she stays here while we verify her status. She stays with me. The administrator looked between them, calculating, and something he saw in Do-hyun's stance made him hesitate. And finally, he stepped back with a grunt that might have been amusement or contempt. Take your defective Veluxi and leave, he said. But know that I have already transmitted your ship registration to parties who may be interested. And your problems are only beginning. Do-hyun did not reply. He put his hand on Yuna's shoulder and guided her back to the ship. And they were in hyperspace within the hour. They will come for me, Yuna said quietly as the stars blurred past the viewport. Yes, Do-hyun agreed. They probably will. You should let me go before that happens. Do-hyun turned from the navigation console to face her directly. Do you want to go? Yuna hesitated. And in that hesitation, she found her answer. No, she whispered. Then you stay, Do-hyun said simply. And we figure out the rest together. Her skin flickered in colors she was beginning to recognize as something like hope. The lower levels of Station Core 7 smelled like rust and forgotten things. And Yuna had learned to call this place home because no other place would have her. She pressed her thin body against the cold metal wall as an enforcement drone hummed past, its scanners sweeping the corridor for what the station authorities called biological refuse, which meant beings like her who had no registration, no purpose, and no one to speak for them. The drone moved on, and Yuna allowed herself to breathe again. She was Veluxi, and once that word had meant something precious across the galaxy, for her species was born with skin that glowed with bioluminescence, shifting colors that translated emotions with perfect clarity. And wealthy species paid fortunes to own Veluxi companions who could read the feelings of everyone in a room and display them like living art. But Yuna was broken. Her skin flickered and pulsed without reason. Random bursts of pale blue and sickly green that meant nothing and responded to nothing. And this defect had mocked her from the moment of her birth as worthless. She remembered the day her clan had sold her to the merchant collective, how her mother had looked away and her father had counted the credits with steady hands. And she remembered thinking that perhaps the collective would find a way to fix her, that perhaps she could still become something of value. The collective had tried. Yuna closed her eyes against the memory of the procedures, the needles and the machines and the handlers who spoke about her as though she could not hear, discussing whether her defect was neural or genetic or spiritual, debating which methods might force her light to obey. Nothing had worked. After 2 cycles of failed treatments, the collective had brought her to this station and left her in the lower market with nothing but the thin thermal wrap she still wore around her shoulders. And a handler had told her that she was now a write-off, an acceptable loss, and that the collective wished her a peaceful end that had been 40 rotations ago. Yuna had survived by learning the rhythms of the station's forgotten places, by knowing which food vendors threw away scraps at which hours, by finding the warm spots near the power conduits where she could sleep without freezing, and by making herself small and invisible whenever anyone with authority passed by. She had watched countless ships dock and depart from her hiding spots near the lower hangars, and she had stopped imagining that any of them might carry her away to something better, because hope was a luxury that beings like her could not afford. Today, she crouched behind a stack of discarded cargo containers, watching the market vendors pack up their stalls for the night cycle, and her skin flickered uselessly in shades of orange and violet that meant nothing at all. A new ship had docked an hour ago, a battered human freighter with scorch marks on its hull and a name painted in letters she could not read. And she had watched its single occupant descend the boarding ramp with the careful steps of someone who had been alone in space for too long. Humans were strange creatures. The galactic community had only known them for a few generations, and opinions varied wildly on what to make of them, for they came from a world so harsh and dangerous that other species called it a death planet. Yet they seemed softer than their origin suggested, prone to attachments and emotions that more practical species found inefficient. This human was male, middle-aged by their standards, with dark hair showing threads of gray and a face that carried weight beyond its years. And he moved through the market with the quiet purpose of someone searching for something specific. Yuna should have stayed hidden. She knew the rules of survival in the lower levels, and the first rule was to never draw attention. But her hiding spot behind the containers gave her a clear view of the human as he haggled with a parts dealer. And something about the way he stood made her careless. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He looked like someone carrying something heavy that no one else could see. Yuna leaned forward without thinking, and a loose panel beneath her knee scraped against metal with a sound that echoed through the quiet market. The human turned. For one frozen moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Yuna saw surprise in his expression followed by something else, something she could not name. And then the moment shattered as two enforcement Drones descended from the ceiling with their scanners already locked on her position, unregistered. Biological material detected. One drone announced in its flat mechanical voice. Initiating removal protocol. Yuna knew what removal meant. She had seen it happen to others. The drones herding unwanted beings toward the waste processing centers, where they would be disposed of efficiently and without paperwork. And she scrambled backward, even though she knew there was nowhere to run. "Wait," the human said. And his voice cut through the drone's programmed responses with an authority that made both machines pause their advance. "She is with me." The drone swiveled toward him. "Clarification required," the first drone stated. "This biological unit shows no registration to any vessel or entity currently docked at this station. She is my contracted crew member," the human said. And he spoke the lie with such steady conviction that Yuna almost believed it herself. "There must be an error in your system. And I would hate to file a complaint about station security harassing registered personnel." The drones exchanged some silent communication. "Registration verification will require administrative processing," the second drone said. "And a verification fee of 800 credits. The human did not hesitate. He pulled a credit chip from his jacket and held it out. And the drone scanned it and chirped in confirmation. And then both machines rose back toward the ceiling, as though Yuna had never existed at all. She stayed pressed against the containers, shaking, waiting for the human to demand payment or service, or whatever price he would extract for this intervention. He walked toward her slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal. And he stopped at a distance that let her keep the containers between them. "My name is Kang Do-hyun," he said. "I have a ship with an empty cabin and food that needs eating. And if you want, you can come with me until you figure out where you want to go." Yuna stared at him. "Why?" she whispered. And her skin flickered in confused patterns of white and gray. Do-hyun looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his tired eyes. Something old and sad and strangely gentle, because no one should have to hide behind cargo containers waiting to be thrown away. He said simply, "Will you come?" Yuna did not trust him. She had learned long ago that kindness from strangers always carried a hidden cost. But the enforcement drones would return eventually. And the cold was seeping through her thermal wrap. And this human was offering her something she had stopped believing existed. She stood on shaking legs and followed him toward his ship. The freighter was called the Patient Hand. And as Yuna walked up its boarding ramp into warmth and light, she waited for the trap to reveal itself. She would keep waiting for a very long time. The cabin was small but clean, with a bed that folded down from the wall and a storage compartment and a tiny viewport that showed the stars outside. And Yuna stood in the doorway, unable to make herself step inside. Do-hyun had brought her through the ship without ceremony, pointing out the galley and the refresher unit and the cargo hold as though she were a guest rather than a stray he had purchased from station security. And now he waited behind her with patience that made her nervous. "This is yours if you want it," he said. "The door locks from inside, and I will not come in unless you ask me to." Yuna turned to look at him, searching his face for the deception she knew must be hiding there. "What do you want from me?" she asked. And her voice came out harsh with suspicion she could not hide. Do-hyun tilted his head slightly, and for a moment he looked almost confused by the question. "I want nothing from you," he said. "You look like you needed help, and I had help to give. And that is all. No one helps without wanting something in return. Perhaps that has been your experience," Do-hyun said quietly. "But it does not have to remain true forever." He took a step back, giving her more space. "There is food in the galley whenever you are hungry, and we will reach our next destination in 3 standard days. And if you want to leave when we dock, I will give you enough credits to find your way somewhere safe." He turned and walked toward the cockpit. Leaving her alone in the corridor, Yuna entered the cabin and locked the door behind her. then sat on the edge of the bed with her back against the wall where she could watch the entrance. And she did not sleep that night because she was certain that something terrible would happen the moment. She closed her eyes. Nothing happened. The ship hummed quietly around her, and occasional footsteps passed her door without stopping. And somewhere in the deep hours of the night cycle, she heard Do-Yun moving in the galley. The soft sounds of someone making tea and drinking it alone when the light shifted to indicate morning. Yuna unlocked her door and crept toward the galley. Drawn by the smell of food and the hollowness in her stomach that had become so familiar, she barely noticed it anymore. Do-Hyun was already there, eating something from a bowl while reading from a datapad, and he looked up when she entered and gestured toward a covered dish on the counter. "I was not sure what you could eat," he said, "so I made rice and vegetables. And there is protein paste if you need it." Yuna took the dish and retreated to the far corner of the galley, eating quickly with her body angled toward the door. And Do-Hyun returned his attention to his datapad as though her presence required nothing from him at all. This pattern continued for 2 days. Do-Hyun went about his work maintaining the ship and plotting their course. And he acknowledged Yuna when their paths crossed, but never pressed her for conversation or company. And gradually, the tight knot of fear in her chest began to loosen, even though she did not trust the loosening on the 3rd day. She found herself lingering in the cockpit doorway, watching him run diagnostic checks on the navigation system. "You can come in," he said without turning around. "The co-pilot seat is more comfortable than standing." Yuna hesitated, then crossed the threshold and lowered herself into the seat he had indicated. And her eyes caught on a small image fixed to the console. A photograph of a young human girl with Do-Hyun's eyes and a bright smile. Do-Hyun followed her gaze, and something in his expression shifted. A crack in the careful steadiness he had maintained since they met. "Her name was Soyeon," he said. "She was my daughter," was the word hung in the air between them. "What happened to her?" Yuna asked, and immediately regretted the question. But Do-Hyun answered without anger. "She got sick," he said simply. "There was a treatment that might have saved her, but it was expensive, and I did not have the credits in time. And she died 3 years ago on a station not so different from the one where I found you." Yuna did not know what to say among the Veluxi. Grief was considered a private inefficiency, something to be processed and released, so it did not interfere with productivity. And she had never learned the words that other species used to comfort each other. "I'm sorry," she managed. And the words felt inadequate. Do-Hyun nodded slowly. "After she died, I sold everything we had and bought this ship. And I have been moving ever since because standing still feels too much like waiting to die myself." He turned to look at her directly, and his tired eyes held no pity, only a strained recognition. "I did not save you because I am a good person, Yuna, and I did not save you because you reminded me of her. Though you are close to the age she would have been now." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I saved you because I saw someone being thrown away, and I could not walk past that and still call myself human." Yuna felt her skin flicker in patterns she could not control. Soft pulses of light that had no meaning but felt somehow like tears. "The collective said I was defective," she whispered. "They said my light was broken and that made me worthless. And my own family agreed." Do-Hyun was quiet for a moment. "Among humans, we have a different understanding," he said at last. "We believe that worth is not something others can give you or take away. And we believe that the broken pieces of a person are still pieces of a person. And we believe that anyone who tells you that you have no value has simply failed to look closely enough." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he rested his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Your light may not work the way others expect," he said, "but that does not mean it is broken, and it does not mean you are worthless. And anyone who taught you otherwise was wrong. Yuna did not know how to respond to kindness so direct and undemanding. She sat in the co-pilot's seat as the stars streamed past outside, and her skin flickered in colors that meant nothing and everything. And for the first time in her memory, she did not feel ashamed of the light when they dropped out of hyperspace near their destination. She asked Oyen if she could stay a little longer. He said yes without conditions. He said yes as though it were the simplest thing in the world.